Thank you, Annette. And thanks to BVGT and to all of you for showing up tonight. I appreciate the fact that you're here, that you have some interest in this topic. Whenever I go to talk about the topic of perfectionism, whether I'm speaking to mental health professionals or to parents or to teachers or whoever it is that I'm going to be talking to, I usually like to say that my audience is typically going to be listening in two-part harmony. I realize that most of you are here this evening because you have kids who you might have some concerns about whether perfectionism might be part of the picture for them. But I also realize that as you listen to what I'm saying, and maybe you've already thought about this, maybe you think of some things about yourselves or maybe your spouses where the topic would apply. And so that's okay. You can listen in two-part harmony. And I always like to tell people that if that is the case, you are in good company, because I do consider myself to be a recovering perfectionist. And I'll talk about that some as we go along this evening. It is entirely possible to recover from perfectionism, so that's the good news, and I'll tell you something about how you might be able to do that, or to help somebody else do it. If we had to reduce the idea of the psychology of perfectionism to a kind of a bumper sticker, this is something like what it would be. Perfectionism is really about what it means to somebody to make a mistake. So if you're the kind of person who, when you do make a mistake, you think it's a learning experience, you certainly might be disappointed about it. You might even be upset about it if you make a mistake. But it's the kind of thing that you say to yourself, okay, so I did that, I'm not really thrilled about it, but I'm going to go ahead and learn from that and do something different the next time. If that's the case, you're probably not a perfectionist. But if you're the kind of person who makes a mistake and worries at some level that what it means is that there may be something wrong with you, or if you worry at some level that what it means is that you're not quite as acceptable as you might like to be to other people, then you're somewhere in the ballpark. And in a few minutes, I'm going to be talking about this whole idea of meaning in human psychology. But perfectionism is really about, I'm sorry, I'm doing my Marco Rubio impression here, but I'm going to try to stay hydrated. I won't stare at the camera while I do it. You know, when we're thinking about the idea of overcoming perfectionism, we have a problem in our culture because we really live in a kind of a perfectionistic society. We have a winner-take-all culture that we live in. And you're all familiar, and I'll be talking in a few minutes about some of the pressures that we all experience. But the example that I always like to give about that is with the Olympics. If you've watched the Olympics at any time, and you've watched an award ceremony, and so you're watching on television, and there's the podia up there, and the medals are being handed out. It's always been interesting to me that you're not probably hearing a story going along with that about the three best athletes in all time, about people who came within fractions of a second of each other and you know, ran a great race and things like that. You may hear comments like that, but basically it's not the story that you're hearing. The story that you're likely to be hearing is a story about the gold medalists and the losers. The gold medalists and the people who almost made the grade but didn't quite do it, who tried so hard but in the end weren't able to accomplish their goals. If you're a perfectionist, this is really your worst nightmare, because the message and what you're hearing in all of that color commentary about the award ceremony is that in our culture you're either perfect or you're worthless. That's basically what that comes down to. And so again, if you're dealing with perfectionism in yourself or in your family, it's like pushing a rock up a hill, living in the culture that we live in. If you can't read that, it says there'll be plenty of time for playing after you get into college. These little kids. There are a lot of pressures that we all deal with in this society of ours. I'm going to tell you a story this evening about a young woman that I worked with some years ago. I'm going to call her Ava. It's not her actual name, and some of the details of her story are changed to protect her privacy. But I want to use Ava as an example of some of the kinds of things I want to tell you about perfectionism. We're going to learn some things about what perfectionism is. We'll learn about where I think it comes from. And given what I think about where it comes from, we'll learn about what I think is the best thing to be able to do about it. So Ava saw me first as a young woman. She was in high school. And Ava came to see me. Her parents brought her to see me because some big things had been starting to happen in her life that hadn't happened before. Ava is the kind of kid who sailed through elementary school and always did exceptionally well. She'd been identified as a gifted student. She was a straight A student. Not only she was a straight A student, but she tended to be a straight A student without breaking a sweat, really, without putting a whole lot of effort into it. What had happened to Ava is that she had gotten to high school and she had enrolled in a bunch of honors courses and advanced placement courses. And in addition to that, Ava was a very active member of the school's orchestra. She was a first chair clarinetist. And in addition to that, she was working on the school's yearbook. And in addition to that, her family was active in their church community, and Ava had organized a volunteer effort as part of their social justice program and was overseeing the volunteers and the program and setting up the programming and so forth. And so, in other words, Ava was doing a whole lot of things. Ava was actually fairly overloaded when she came to see me. But what had started to happen was that Ava was not doing as well in school as she had before. And then it seems like everything came apart at the seams. Ava had gotten more withdrawn. She had gotten what looked like depression. She had started to pull away from her friends. When Ava was growing up, she was part of a circle of friends who were also gifted. They all had great times together. They were all very successful at what they were doing together. They all really liked each other, and now Ava had started to sort of pull away from them. And her parents were obviously rightly concerned about her and wanted to know what was going on with her. And I'm going to tell you a couple of other parts of the story as we go on this evening to say a little bit more about what I think was going on with Ava. I want to tell you some things about what perfectionism is. And one of the ways that I have of doing that is to tell you some things about perfectionistic behaviors and thoughts and feelings. I'm sorry that you don't have a handout with you. I think, is that going to be available on the website?
Yes.
Yes. So you should be able to go on the BVGT website and get a copy of this. You're welcome to do that and download it. So don't feel that you have to copy all of this down and get it perfectly. But I'm going to mention some of the things on this list. And by the way, this is a list of characteristic behaviors of perfectionists. It's not an exhaustive list. If you see yourself on this list, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a perfectionist. Although in general, the more you see yourself on this list, the more likely it is that perfectionism would be a part of the picture for you. So in other words, the list isn't perfect. And I do want to mention a couple of the things that are on there. The first one about overcommitment, that's Ava. That's kind of the stereotypical perfectionist. It's the person who does everything and does everything well. And if you ask them about it, they feel like they have to do everything not just well, but perfectly. Again, it's a kind of a stereotype of a perfectionist. Not all perfectionists are that way, but Ava was. There are a couple of other things on this list. Perfectionists are sometimes the kinds of people who arrive places late because there's always one more thing to do on their way out the door. This would be me. I've gotten better about this, you'll be glad to know. But some of you may recognize this. You know, you're going to go somewhere and you're headed out and you see something that needs to be done, a task around the house or something you forgot to write, or whatever it is, and you figure, okay, well, I've got time. I'll go ahead and do this. Now, if you are a perfectionist, you are also the kind of person who won't start a job without finishing it. I mean, that's very important. So you'll do this, and of course, in the process of doing it, frequently you'll run across other things that look like, this is just a little thing, I can do this too. That way it won't be hanging over my head when I get home, and I can relax and everything will be fine, so I'll just do this too. And of course I have to do that and finish it. And by the time you're done with all that, it's late. Now, perfectionism in a lot of cases comes in a couple of different flavors. And this is one of those cases because, as you can well imagine, and maybe some of you are identifying with this, there are some perfectionists who would never, ever, ever, ever be late for anything, and so they're not going to do this kind of deal. So they're going to show up early wherever it is that they're going, and if there's something that needs to be done at home, we just ignore that and run out the door. So again, there may be a couple of different flavors to this, but people who behave that way can very well be perfectionistic. Perfectionists are the kind of people who typically pay more attention to negative than to positive comments. So if I do a presentation and 50 people come up to me and tell me how much they learned from it and how fantastic they thought it was and how helpful I've been and I've changed their lives for the better, and one person says, yeah, it was okay, I'll be up at 3 in the morning wondering what that person meant by that, and I will have forgotten all of the other comments. Now, there is a reason that perfectionists are that way, and that's going to become clear as I go on tonight. The last item on this list is a surprise to some people. It's procrastination. Not all procrastinators are perfectionistic, okay? And certainly not all perfectionists procrastinate. As I said before, another flavor of perfectionism, if it's a question of getting something in on time, you will have it in ahead of time if you're a perfectionist. But there are some perfectionists who do procrastinate. And if you're talking about a student, for example, there's some students who, when you talk to them about this, you begin to realize that it almost seems worth it to them to be in battles and arguments with their teachers and their parents, more worth it to do that than it is to hand the thing in and take the risk that they're going to make less than an A on it. And that's where the procrastination comes in. It's just too overwhelming to think about that maybe you don't know enough to do this right, or maybe you're going to say something that's silly or off base or whatever it is, and it's so overwhelming and so anxiety-provoking to think about that you don't end up actually doing the assignment. And that's where the procrastination comes from. I've finished my New Year's resolutions, and now I'm going to get a running start on yours. It's an example of some perfectionistic behaviors. The next list is thoughts that many perfectionists have. We all do a certain amount of internal self-talk. We have little messages we give ourselves. Maybe it's not always in coherent English, but there are messages there nonetheless, and when we talk to somebody, you can find out what some of these are. And if you're a perfectionist, these kinds of thoughts are likely to be in the mix somewhere. And again, same disclaimer about the list. It may not be exhaustive and so on and so forth, but in general, the more you see yourself on this list, the more likely it can be. Perfectionists frequently tell themselves, I should be able to do everything, and I should be able to do everything well. or perfectly. I mean, that's part of the internal self-talk there. Perfectionists are frequently the kinds of people who tell themselves that they should be able to do everything right the first time. This is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons that a lot of gifted kids will sit out on the sidelines on the athletic field. And what they are frequently thinking to themselves is, if I'm going to go out there and take the risk to make a fool of myself, I should really know all the things that there are to know about the strategy and the tactics of the game and you know, how to follow the rules and all that. And I don't know any of those things, so I'm not even going to try. Learning curves are definitely not for perfectionists. Now, there's a couple of items on this particular list that I'm going to stress a lot. They have a lot to do with what I think about the origins of perfectionism. One of those is the internal thought that I'm never good enough. The book that I wrote for middle schoolers is called What to Do When Good Enough Isn't Good Enough, and this is what that's about. And as we'll see later on, there are certain ways in which people come to believe this about themselves, and we'll talk about that. But the internal message is, I'm never good enough. No matter how hard I try, no matter how much effort and energy I put into this, it really is never perfect, and so therefore it's never good enough. And the other one is, if I goof up, then it means that something is wrong with me. And that's back to the first thing that I was talking about what it means to make a mistake. If you think about this, if I goof up, something is wrong with me. You can understand when I say that for perfectionism, there's a certain amount of shame involved. And when we talk about shame, psychologically, what we're talking about is a feeling of defectiveness and also a feeling of a lack of acceptability to others. And I think this is a very important underlying issue in perfectionism, and so I'm going to come back to that. The third list is some feelings, or as we say in my biz, affects that go along with perfectionism. Perfectionists are frequently the kinds of people who get disgusted or angry with themselves when they are criticized. There's a lot of anxiety involved with perfectionism, as we're going to see. And if a perfectionist is criticized about something, this shame that I was talking about tends to come up. And so in response to that, a perfectionist can feel very bad about themselves, and frequently the response to that is to be angry. Anger is what we call a disjunctive emotion. It says to other people, get out of my face. It's a way of getting more emotional distance from someone who has criticized you because it's too painful to think about that criticism, to think about the fact that the person might actually be right. Perfectionists sometimes are the kinds of people who get angry if their routine is interrupted. This would also be me, and I'm a bit better about that these days. But if you think about this, if you're a perfectionist, so you have to do everything and you have to do everything well, one of the ways that you can help yourself to do that is by having routines that you build up. And you know, these can be routines that you use in a laboratory, but they can also be routines that you use at home. And I'm talking about things like, you know, get up, get dressed, brush your teeth, you know, get out the door, whatever. The little routines that we do. And it sounds trivial and it sounds funny, but if you're a perfectionist and you're in the midst of one of these routines and somebody comes along and says, honey, can you get milk on the way home from work today? You'll be angry because you've been thrown off track. Now I don't remember where I was. I don't remember what I was thinking about anymore. And the problem with that is that whatever it is you're in the midst of doing, you start to worry that it won't be done well enough. Or of course it won't be done perfectly. And when you worry about that, you get very upset about it and you can get angry. And perfectionists are also frequently the kinds of people who are afraid of appearing incompetent. This is back to the kid that I was talking about sitting on the sidelines. There's some fear involved in this, or some anxiety about opening your mouth and appearing incompetent. Among the examples I can think of about that are the one that I was involved in with a young man I was working with, and the story that came out was that he knew a whole lot about a particular subject that he and a friend of his spent a lot of time talking about. It was an activity that they were both involved in that was great. And he told me that his friend was puzzled by something that happened to him once, which was that they were in a group of people, some of whom my client didn't actually know, but the topic came around to this particular thing that this young man and his buddy knew a whole lot about, and this young man was completely silent. He didn't say anything. And his friend said to him afterwards, "So what's with you?" He said, we just finished talking about this a couple of days ago, and I was arguing this particular point with these people, and you weren't saying anything. What's up with that? Well, this young man was afraid that in this particular group, it didn't have anything to do with how much he knew. It had to do with his fears and his anxieties about the fact that he was going to open his mouth and say something wrong and look like a fool, and there was no way he was going to allow himself to do that. So he didn't. So there are a lot of ways that we have of doing research on perfectionism, and there's research that's been done on perfectionism over the last probably 30 or 40 years in a number of different ways. One of them that's very well known has to do with a questionnaire that's given to people, and it's called the multidimensional perfectionism scale. There are actually two of those. I won't go into the weeds with all of that, but the point about the first one is that if you do personality inventory with people and you have some kind of a testing device that you can use to demonstrate that people are actually perfectionistic, and then you go to correlate that with certain personality characteristics, the outstanding one that you find about perfectionists, you might think it's pride in accomplishments or something like that. It isn't actually. The outstanding personality characteristic is concern over mistakes. If you test perfectionists, people who you know to be perfectionists because you've tested them out with a standardized test, and you correlate that with personality characteristics, that's what you're going to end up finding, concern over mistakes. And this goes to what I was saying about there being a lot of anxiety connected with perfectionism. When Anna Quindlen, the author, was giving the commencement speech at Mount Holyoke College some years ago, she was talking about her own experience as a college freshman and her own perfectionism, which she referred to as a backpack full of bricks. Perfectionism is a burden, and as we'll see, the burdensome part of it is all of the anxiety that a person has over making a mistake. That's a heavy burden to carry around. There is some fascinating research that was done back in the 80s and related research that just came out a couple of years ago, in which the basic paradigm for the research is you take a group of very highly successful people in some endeavor. And I think law students were studied, and I think athletes were studied, and a bunch of different groups of people in a variety of these studies. And you give them again, a perfectionism scale, some kind of an instrument that could determine whether these people were perfectionistic or not. And the interesting finding about that is that among people in any of these fields who are most highly successful, they are less likely to be perfectionistic than people in the same field who are a bit less successful. Now, if you think about that for a second, it goes along with everything I've just said, because if perfectionism is about anxiety over making mistakes, you become very self-conscious about how you're doing rather than being concerned about what you're doing, and that gets in your way. Perfectionism will trip you up. it makes things worse and not better, and there's research to support that. There's research that demonstrates that perfectionism can have a profound influence on intimate relationships. And the reason for that is because, first of all, there is a lot of anxiety involved in perfectionism, and the partner of a very anxious person can be anxious about that. But also because if you're a perfectionist and everything has to be done perfectly, and you're doing something with a partner, the partner also has to be perfect. Because if you're a perfectionist and the thing doesn't turn out perfectly, it's on your plate. And so you tend to drive your partner very hard if you're in an intimate relationship with somebody and you're a perfectionist. And again, there's research that demonstrates that. We also know that in much more grim ways, perfectionism is involved frequently with issues of depression and suicidality. There are studies that have been done on people who have either attempted suicide or actually committed suicide, where in a number of cases perfectionism has been part of the picture. And the idea there is that for some people, and there is depression that goes along with this, of course, it's not just about perfectionism, but for some people they become so hopeless about ever being able to be perfect and so hopeless about ever being able to be acceptable to other people that they get overwhelmed with that, and if suicidality is part of the picture, the perfectionism can push them over the edge. So perfectionism is about anxiety. And perfectionism is about anxiety about ever making a mistake. And for perfectionists, what a mistake means is that there is something wrong with you and you're not as acceptable as you would like to be. I always like to make a distinction for people between what I'll call pursuing excellence and perfectionism. And I think this is an important distinction to make in understanding what perfectionism is. You can be the kind of person who puts an enormous amount of energy and effort into something. You can be the kind of person who burns the candle at both ends. You can be the kind of person who stomps up and down and gets very upset and angry about not doing as well as you thought you might have done or as you would like to do. And while perfectionists are frequently like that, in and of itself, that's not what perfectionism is. In the lived experience of a perfectionist, it's not just about working hard to be perfect. It's about the fear of what it means when you make a mistake. And that's really the bright line that separates pursuing excellence from perfectionism. It's this anxiety about making mistakes. So perfectionism is the desire to be perfect, and by that I don't mean almost perfect. It's the desire to be perfect. It's the fear of imperfection, and it's the emotional conviction that unless you're perfect, you're not entirely acceptable as a person. So in gifted and talented circles, there's a lot of conversation about healthy perfectionism. I have a particular attitude about that some of you who've heard me talk before know about. And in fact, the first professional paper that I published on the topic of perfectionism was part of a series of articles on the topic. And the first part of that title is Healthy Perfectionism is an Oxymoron. If you're a perfectionist, the perfectionism that you experience is like the leading and trailing edge of a single wing. Perfectionists are people who desire to do things perfectly, but perfectionists are also the people who fear making mistakes. And if you're a perfectionist, in your lived experience, you don't separate those two. They go together. They're like two sides of one coin. And the burdensome element of perfectionism is this anxiety about making a mistake. And so, again, the bright line between pursuing excellence and perfectionism is the anxiety about making mistakes. And there's no perfectionist I've talked to who is seriously concerned about their perfectionism who will tell you that it's healthy. It is a burden, and they feel the burden. They enjoy being successful, there's no question about that, and they sometimes feel that it's their perfectionism that makes them successful. But that leads to Greenspon's mantras, because if you think about everything that I've just said to you about the nature of perfectionism, you'll understand what I mean when I say that perfectionists are successful despite their perfectionism and not because of it. Remember, the research shows that if you're perfectionistic, it gets in your way. The anxiety makes it more difficult for you to do what you need to do. I once had a client who was a surgeon, a very good surgeon, and he was in to talk to me about a number of issues, but one of them was his perfectionism. And he said, I'm afraid if I lose my perfectionism, I'll lose my edge. And we had a lot of conversations about that. And I said to him, look, if I had a magic wand, and this is a joke with us, I actually, my wife Barbara has a magic wand in her office, and I have a crystal ball in mine. And it's been, I don't know, 35 years we've been trying to figure out how to work these things, and we haven't figured it out yet. But if I did have a magic wand, and if I could wave it over his head and get rid of his perfectionism, the research shows that if anything, he might be a better surgeon. Now, he was a really outstanding surgeon, so I doubt it would improve things that much. But on the other hand, in most cases, if anything, it would make the person more successful and not less. Why is that? Because my magic wand wouldn't do anything to his talent. It wouldn't do anything to his level of energy. Actually, it might improve that because there wouldn't be so much anxiety. And it wouldn't do anything to his sense of commitment to his profession. His success is based on talent and energy and commitment. It is not based on his perfectionism. That was my position. And there's been a lot of conversation about this actually in medical fields, and you have a lot of physicians talking about this notion that the perfect is the enemy of the good. You know, I used to joke that I'd like my surgeon to be a perfectionist. I may not want to marry her. But I've rethought that over the years. Actually, I wouldn't like my surgeon to be a perfectionist. I would just like them to do the best job they know how to do and not stand there wondering whether they should go this way or that way and what's the right way to do that and oh, did I do that one wrong? Or yes, I don't want that going on while I'm waiting to have my veins repaired or whatever it is. So now let's take a look at the question of where perfectionism might come from. And I'll give you the second part of the story about Ava. So Ava grew up in a home with her sister. Ava's mother and father are both lawyers. Ava's mother actually retired from her practice to raise the two daughters. And as it turns out, Ava's mother has experienced some depression. And actually, as it turns out, Ava's mother and father were also in therapy with me, again, for a variety of reasons. But her mom was very bright, but because of the depression that she was experiencing, was somewhat emotionally distant. Ava's dad, on the other hand, was a law professor with an international reputation, really. And so he traveled a lot. And so Ava's mom wasn't always emotionally present in the way she might have liked to have been, and Ava's dad was not always physically present. But when he was home, there was a certain thing that he used to do. in the family that he wanted everybody to enjoy, which was when they were sitting around the dinner table, he would throw out questions for people to answer. And these would be pointed questions and very sophisticated ones, and he would be always trying to catch the other members of the family not being able to answer the question and so forth. And so, as it turns out, one of the things that Ava learned in her years growing up in this family was that in order to make the kind of connection that she wanted with her father, who was the most immediately available when he was physically present, the best thing she could do was to answer all the questions perfectly. Now, there were a bunch of other things that went along with this, but that was one of the things. And so Ava was literally learning the message that in order to be acceptable, the best thing I can do is to make myself perfect. In this case, answer all of the questions perfectly. So I'm going to use that as a kind of an example to tell you some things about basic human psychology. And I want to talk with you about 3 elements of human psychology that I consider to be fairly universal. I'll talk with you about meaning, and about emotions, and about connections. And the first of these is meaning. We've already touched on this a bit. So every second of every day, we all make sense of our world in some way. For a lot of that making sense of the world, we share with other people. You all have pretty similar ideas about what you're doing here this evening. You all have pretty similar ideas about, how to put your clothes on and how to drive your car and how to listen to somebody talk and how to make notes and all of this and all the rest of the kinds of things you do with your lives. But there are some elements of the way we make sense of our worlds that are unique to us and that are different for different people. If you're a perfectionist, this goes along with what I'm saying about the way you make sense out of making a mistake. For Ava, making a mistake meant that she was running the risk of not being liked as much by her father. That's what making a mistake means to her. It is Ava's sense of reality. And we can look at that from the outside and we can disagree with her. We can say, oh, that couldn't be the case, and no, of course he loves you, and so on and so forth. But if we're going to understand Ava in a way that we can help her, we need to understand what it means to her, how she makes sense of her world and what her sense of reality is. And to Ava, making a mistake means, again, she runs the risk of not being liked as much by her father. The central element of motivation in our lives is our emotionality. We spend all of our lives, if you want to broad brush it, we're seeking pleasure and we're seeking to avoid pain. We spend all of our lives looking for solace and help when we're feeling sad or lonely or when we're grieving about something, and we look for affirmation and acceptance when we're feeling excited and happy about things. And all of these emotional states that we have motivate all the things that we do with our lives. And if you're a perfectionist, you spend a good deal of your time, and if you want to understand the underlying motivations for what perfectionists are doing, you can see this through this particular lens, which is perfectionists are people who spend a lot of their lives avoiding or diminishing the anxiety that they have about making a mistake. This is why a perfectionist will drive himself or herself so hard to be perfect. It's because if they aren't perfect, the shame comes up, the anxiety comes up, and they want to avoid that, and the only way that they can think of to avoid it, the reality for them, the way they make sense of the world, is that they can try their best to make themselves perfect. And the third element about human psychology that I want to refer to here is a sense of connection. We are built to be connected to one another as human beings. The way I like to put it, in our evolutionary history, we were never big enough or strong enough or fast enough to survive without banding together in some way. And it turns out that we band together with our language and our social customs and our ability to empathize with one another. I'm going to say some more things about empathy in a little bit. But we make these connections with one another, and it turns out that those connections are vital to us. They begin at least at birth, if not before. There's good research and interesting stuff now that shows that in utero, fetuses are learning things from their mothers, and some amazing things that they learn. But certainly from the moment we're born into a relational environment. And if we're born into a relational environment that is somewhat emotionally distant and disconnected, this can not only be dangerous, it can be fatal. We know this from these awful studies that were done after the Second World War in these orphanages where infants were being raised. They were kept perfectly safe, they were nourished, kept well fed and so forth, but the staff didn't connect with the infants very much, and they developed this condition that pediatricians call failure to thrive. And in some cases, those conditions are fatal. And so we are crucially dependent on human connections all of our lives. It's not something we ever grow out of. We talk about becoming autonomous as adults, but what we really mean by that is that we have a sense of boundaries about who we are, but it's who we are in context with all of the relationships that are important to us in our lives, and that's always the case. And so this is why it was so crucial for Ava to maintain a sense of connection with her father, because without that, the anxiety of being alone and being disconnected is overwhelming. And so she did whatever she could think of to do to connect with him. She did some things to try to connect with her mother as well, but I'm simplifying the story for our purposes here tonight. But with her father, this is why she came up with this routine of answering all of his questions, because she needed emotionally to have that connection with him. So perfectionism is at bottom a self-esteem issue. As I said earlier, it's an issue about feeling okay about yourself, despite the fact that you may have made a mistake. If you can't do that, then perfectionism is probably a part of the picture. So where does all this come from? One of the questions that people have is perfectionism genetic in some way? As I'm remembering it, it was at the end of last November, I guess, I was interviewed for an article in the Wall Street Journal, and it was picked up by various other media. I was on an NPR radio show about this, because a study had just come out that supposedly demonstrated that perfectionism can be genetic. Since I'm somewhat allergic to that concept, it's hard for me to imagine a gene or even a small number of genes that could contribute to something as complex, a personality construct as perfectionism. And I think I'm right about that. And actually, when I looked at the study that was reported in the Wall Street Journal, it doesn't really show this. Again, I won't get into the details about my thinking about that, but there really isn't any good evidence that it's genetic. Now, there are some parts of perfectionism that may actually have some genetic inflows. Perfectionists many times are very anxious. Anxiety probably has, in part, a biological basis. Certainly perfectionists are very persistent, and we think that temperamentally persistence may have some sort of genetic inflow, but you can be anxious and you can be persistent and not be perfectionistic. So to my way of thinking, at least, it's too complex a personality construct to actually be genetically based. To my way of thinking, perfectionism is governed by the relational environment in which we find ourselves. And Ava is an example of this. To my way of thinking, the reason that Ava became perfectionistic is because, in her particular case, she was attempting to maintain this connection with her father by getting everything perfect. There are a variety of environments that can give rise to perfectionism. Certainly there are families which are hypercritical, always critical of everybody and everything, and if you're a child in an environment like that, you can easily get the idea that there's something wrong with everybody, and therefore there's something wrong with me, and if I'm going to be okay with my family, and if I'm going to avoid these criticisms, then one possibility is to make myself perfect. And so I become a perfectionist under those circumstances. There's some families who are fix-it families, who feel that they need to do everything for their children. Here, let me do that. I can do that more quickly. You know, we need to get out of here. Let me do that for you. It isn't that we shouldn't do that at times for our kids, but the problem is that if that's basically what's happening in your home, your child may be learning that no matter how well they do something, it isn't going to be good enough. And so they may have the struggle of trying to perfect themselves so that they will finally be able to do this on their own, whatever this is, any of those tasks. And again, not all kids are going to react that way, but some will, and that can be the genesis of perfectionism. There are some families that parent educators refer to as push-pull families. You know, this is the kid who comes home with 780 out of 800 on the SATs, and all she hears is, so what happened to the other 20 points? The message of that, if you think about it, is you're never good enough. There's always something that you could have done better. When I was sitting around with the editorial staff writing my first book about this, we were talking about these kinds of things, and one of the editors said, boy, is that my family. She said, when I applied to college, this is a very gifted woman who was talking, she said, I got into several really good liberal arts colleges, one of which she ended up going to, and the only thing her father ever said about that was, well, it's not the Ivies. Interestingly, in the recovery community, so in the organization called Adult Children of Alcoholics, there's a lot of discussion about perfectionism and about how that might arise in alcoholic families, where there's a certain amount of emotional chaos and disconnection, and where there's a certain amount of trauma and anxiety and so forth. And some people in families like that come to the conclusion that if they can just make themselves perfect, then everybody's going to be proud of them and happy for them, and maybe they'll stop drinking as much or stop fighting and arguing as much or whatever. And another element of that for a lot of people in that particular recovery community is that what they ended up discovering was that the one place that they could find some self-esteem is either in school or on the athletic field or both, or in music or the arts or whatever it is. And so their struggle was to be perfect, because that would make them not only more acceptable but more praiseworthy by people outside of their family, because they weren't going to get any of that kind of affirmation within the families that they were in. There's an interesting sidelight in this Wall Street Journal article. They were talking about several people who are perfectionistic, people who you know, and one of them is Barbara Streisand. Now, I don't know a whole lot about her history, but the little squib that went along with this article, she's very clear about this, that, and Barbara Streisand apparently is highly perfectionistic when it comes to her music. You want to be very careful if you're a musician working with her. And she says she grew up in a very chaotic home, and the one place in her life where she felt she could bring some order was in her music. And so that was going to be perfect, because it's the only place where she could exist and feel good about herself. And that's the kind of thing that that we're talking about when we talk about the relational origins of perfectionism. Now, one of the issues that comes up a lot is whether perfectionism is part of giftedness. My frank answer to that is no. Perfectionism will go along with giftedness a lot. Some of you know the research of Christy Neumeister at Ball State, one of my favorite researchers in this area. And Christy and I did a review of the literature a few years ago. In fact, we presented this at NAGC. There isn't any evidence in the literature that giftedness and perfectionism necessarily go along with one another. And in fact, the one study that was done some years ago that was at all reliable and that was done, using good research routines and so forth, found that there actually was no connection between them. There are reasons that gifted kids can be vulnerable to perfectionism. For one thing, if you're a gifted kid and you spend a significant amount of your life in school where, because you're gifted, you have the capacity to do extremely well, if you're a perfectionist, then you're going to put a lot of energy into that, and that's where that's going to come out. So giftedness and perfectionism can go along together in that way. Another thing, as you might realize, is that frequently gifted kids come from families who are highly demanding. And in fact, their attitude a lot of times is, because you're gifted, you should be able to make straight A's. And it's not, again, that that's an irrational thought. It's true. If you have a child with strong intellectual prowess, we have a reason to expect that they're going to do very well. But the problem with that expectation is that you run a risk. And the risk is that the message that you're giving to your children is, first of all, because you're gifted, you have to be perfect. And secondly, and more ominously, if you're not perfect, it probably means you're not gifted. I'll have more to say about that in a second, too. So it is a self-esteem issue, and because of that, when you're talking about overcoming perfectionism or freeing yourself from it or whatever, it isn't like fixing a leaky faucet. We don't have a 6-step procedure to fix your perfectionism. It is literally a recovery process. If you think about what I've been saying about the basic psychology that's involved here, you're hoping to change a person's sense of reality. In my working with Ava, basically the work that we were doing was around this issue of you don't have to be perfect in order to be acceptable. And also around this issue of, because you're not doing as well as you were in school, that doesn't mean that you're not gifted. And so she and I talked about that a lot also. So I'm going to talk about the things I think that are important as elements of overcoming perfectionism, and I'll give you the last part of the vignette to set the stage for that. So I had a conversation with Ava about inviting her parents to come in to talk about this issue that I've mentioned to you about what goes on in their home. This took a while for her to get around to having the courage to do this, but she did, and she invited her mom and dad in. And with great courage and with great diplomacy, she raised the issue with both of her parents about what goes on when dad comes home and sits around the table, and it's really clear that he wants everybody to be able to answer these questions, and he's trying to trip everybody up. And Ava talked to him about this, and she said to him, "It seems to me that if I don't answer all of these questions, that you won't like me as much." Now, when Ava said that, in this particular case, and I'm not trying to come across as a magician here, this is a case that worked out really well. something almost magical happened in that particular session, and we had to do some more work on this as time went on. But Ava's dad got very thoughtful when she said this to him. And he said, I didn't mean it to be that way. And he apologized to her. He said, I'm sorry that that's the way it comes across. I have to think about that a bit. Well, Ava's dad had been in therapy, and so he was relatively quickly able to put two and two together, not exactly in this session, but soon. And so we all got together again, and Ava's dad had had an interesting insight. He said, you know, when I come home and I ask these questions, I hear you telling me that if you don't get the answers correct, you think I won't like you as much. But it turns out I'm not really thinking about you. I'm thinking about me, and I'm thinking about where I've come from. Ava's dad grew up in a home with a very demanding and very imperious father who insisted that everybody be outstanding at everything that they did. And Ava's dad came to the conclusion that what he was trying to do, his dad had passed on at that point, but he was still trying to demonstrate to him that he was raising very bright daughters, and so therefore he was a great parent. This is what he was trying to demonstrate to his own father. So the reason this is so interesting is because the encounter between Ava and her father had a different meaning for Ava than it did to her father. Their sense of reality about this encounter was radically different. Ava thought if she didn't get the answers to the questions correct, that her father wouldn't like her as much. Ava's dad thought that if his daughter didn't get the answer to the questions correct, that he wasn't a good enough father. And so when they found that out about each other and then were able to talk about this together, suddenly the situation started to make sense in a whole different way. And that was the beginning of a serious recovery process. Now, it took place over time. This isn't a magic aha moment, although it is an aha moment. And lots of things came out of that, but basically that's what it came down to. As soon as they discovered what the meaning of this was for one another and could talk about that together, then everything began to change. So this certainly is true, but this doesn't mean it's impossible, and you shouldn't lose hope. So I want to talk to you about some of the basic elements in what I've just told you about this encounter with Ava and her family. Now, again, this is a 4-step procedure, and these things that I've got listed up here are not necessarily in any particular order. They're just elements of what happened in the process of Ava getting to the place where she could overcome her perfectionism, that I think are important and I think are applicable in many or all cases where people are trying to free themselves from the yoke of perfectionism. The first of these is empathy. What happened in the session, well, first of all, what happened in the therapy that I was doing with Ava was that I quickly figured out something that I figure out in all of the therapy that I do, whether it's with perfectionism or not. And that is that if I'm going to help Ava, I have to understand what the world is like from her point of view. I can look at her and I can say, this is a gifted student who's now doing poorly in school and is withdrawing from her friends, and I can come to all kinds of conclusions about that. And again, it's not that those conclusions would be irrational, and some of them I need to investigate. Is she depressed? Does she have an anxiety disorder? Did she get bullied at school? Has she just experienced some trauma that we don't know about that's messing her up in school? I mean, we have to think about all of those things. Has she developed some kind of a mental disorder that's now getting in her way? We have to assess all of those things and think about it. But fundamentally, what we need to do in order to help her is to find out what her world is like. What is the meaning of her world to Ava? And in the process of talking with her mother and father, this is what happened between Ava and her dad. Her father was able to empathize with Ava, and this happened in a number of ways. First of all, he listened to her, and when he listens to her, the message to her is, what you're saying is important to me, so you're important to me. And he was attempting to figure out what it was that Ava was experiencing about the interaction between the two of them. And so he was attempting to empathize with his daughter. And ultimately, as you can tell from the vignette, they were more able to empathize with one another. Self-reflection is very important here. Ava's dad, and this does take courage, and it takes more courage if you're a perfectionist because you're being told that you're not doing something properly. And incidentally, I should take a detour here. There are lots of ways of dealing with perfectionism that are out there in the literature, and all of which I think are very valuable. And so you have these behavioral interventions where you say things like, okay, why don't you go out and purposely make a mistake and maybe make a log of how that feels to you, and come back and we'll talk about it, and you'll begin to see that it's not the end of the world. Now again, that's not an irrational approach, and it can be very useful. The problem that you typically have, though, is that if I say that to somebody who I've just started to work with, I'll send them out to do this assignment, and of course they are going to attempt to do it perfectly. And so I'm doing something that in our business is called iatrogenic. What that means is the doctor causes the illness. And so I need to do something else first. I need to set the stage for this. And this self-reflection is important, and as a matter of fact, it's important to me as a therapist. I have to understand something like what I just told you. You know, I'm developing a relationship with this person, and might it be that something that I'm doing is triggering perfectionistic impulses in this person that I need to know about so we can work on that. But certainly Ava's dad was willing to be self-reflective and to hear what his daughter was saying about how he was contributing to this so he could make up his mind to do something differently. And this brings up another issue, by the way, in therapeutic processes like this. The goal in therapy with these people is not to find out who's at fault. It's not to blame somebody for perfectionism. The goal in this therapeutic process is to figure out how it is that this family got to where they got to. Because if we can figure that out, then it's easier for us to figure out how to go in a different direction. That's the point. Everybody played a role here, and that's inevitable because they're in a relationship with one another, and a relationship is a relationship. One person doesn't cause the problems in a relationship. It has to do with the other person's reactions and the first person's reactions to that and so forth. And so this self-reflection was very important, and for a number of reasons. One, because we came to a more fundamental understanding of what it was that was going on with Ava. But for another thing, there was a very strong message that Ava's dad was giving to Ava when he was being self-reflective, and that message was, you're important to me. It's important to me to figure this out. I do love you. To me, what you're thinking is not what I'm thinking, and so we need to correct this. And he gave hope that it was actually going to be possible to do that. And when he apologized to Ava, what he was saying to her was, I made a mistake, but we can do something about that together. And that is an anti-perfectionistic statement, because her father was literally saying to her, you can make a mistake and still be a human being and still be lovable and do something about the mistake and go on with your life. And that was really an important message, even though it was implicit and not exactly explicit, to give to his daughter, and the two of them could work on that together. The encouragement process is a specific thing, again, in the parent education community that has to do with remembering to tell your kids what you like about them and what you appreciate about them separate from how well they can do. So if you take perfectionistic kids as an example, it is entirely possible to talk to perfectionistic kids about the fact that you appreciate their putting energy and effort into the things that they do, about their taking seriously the work that they have to do, about seeing that that work is important to them and that you're proud of them for that. It's entirely possible to talk to perfectionistic kids about all of those things that are true of them, none of which have anything to do with how well they're doing. And it's really important to make this distinction between who you are and what you do. Unfortunately, in the gifted and talented community, there is a bias towards an assumption that because you're gifted, you're going to do exceptionally well. And again, that also is not an irrational conclusion to make. As I said earlier, it's reasonable to expect gifted kids to do well, but again, whenever you do that, you run a risk that gifted kids will get the impression that if they don't do well, they're not gifted, and you don't like them as well. And so I'm always telling parents it's perfectly okay to jump up and down and scream and yell and smile and laugh when your kid comes home with an A+. It's not that there's anything wrong with doing that, but it's important to understand that you run a risk when you do it, that over time the conclusion is going to be, you're excited about me because I can make A+. So what do you do about that? Well, you get explicit about it and you say, by the way, I'm really excited about the fact that you made an A+, but I hope you know, and this is true for me, I love you even if you don't make an A+. I just want you to know that. I think it's important for parents to be explicit about that. And again, to encourage kids by telling them what you like about them and what you appreciate about them, separate from how well they're doing at something. An old supervisor of mine once said, you can never overdose on encouragement. And the last part of this is dialogue. This is what happened between Ava and her family. When they were able to figure out what was going on here together, they were able to have a conversation together about how to get beyond this. And when we have a conversation with one another, that's the only way that we move closer to anything that we would call an ultimate truth. We all have our own slant on reality. And the only way to expand that is in dialogue with one another. By talking together, we come to a larger realization, just like Ava and her father did in this particular interaction. And so I always think that it's important for parents to talk with their kids about what they see going on. So you see your child starting to write an essay and crumpling it up and throwing the paper in the corner or whatever. And so you might sit down with your child and say, I notice that when you go to do an assignment, it seems to be really difficult for you to get underway with it. Can you tell me what's going on there? You know, what does it feel to you like when you're doing this? Are you thinking about how it's going to turn out? Are you worried that it won't turn out well enough? You start the conversation like that. You start a dialogue with your kids about what it is that you're seeing. Had a parent asked me once in a session that I was doing, he said, I watched my daughter practicing the piano. It was a young daughter, I think she was, 7, 8 years old, something like that. And I see her struggling with it. And she, doesn't want to practice, and she gets really frustrated and disgusted with herself and so on. And he said, I look at her and I see myself in her, because I used to be that way when I was younger also. And he said, I don't want to tell her that because I don't want her to think that, this is a family thing and that there's something wrong with her and so forth. And so I said to him, actually, I would recommend the opposite, because if what's going on with her has anything to do with what's going on with you, then you're an expert on that, and a conversation between the two of you can be really powerful. So if he sits down with his daughter and says, you know, I notice that this is really frustrating for you and I'm wondering what's going on. And the reason I'm wondering about that is because this is the way it used to be with me. And I'm thinking about this and I'm thinking, I know when I sat down, I was always afraid that I wasn't going to do it right and I was going to show up at my piano lesson, the teacher was going to scream at me or, you know, whatever it is. Are you worried about those kinds of things? Now, his daughter might or might not be worried about those, but that's a good conversation starter along the lines of what is it that goes on when you're so frustrated about what's happening. And that kind of dialogue can be very powerful, again, because the message to your child is, you are important to me, what's going on in your life is important to me, and I think if we talk about this together, we can figure this out and we can move it in a different direction. And so I think that those are 4 of the basic elements, anyway, that are involved in any process of recovery from perfectionism. So I'm going to wind up my presentation here and open up the floor for discussion. And I will end with one of my favorite quotes on this topic. And this is a quote from Ornette Coleman, the jazz musician. Some of you in the room may know a whole lot more about him than I do. But at any rate, he is the father of a very improvisational form of jazz music. And apparently he once said to somebody, "It was when I found out I could make a mistake that I knew I was on to something." So thank you for that, and I'll open the floor. Thank you. I hope everybody was clapping.